The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Portobello Road, as vendors prepared their stalls for another busy day at London's famous antique market. Among the usual collection of vintage furniture, old paintings, and dusty trinkets, one particular stall drew curious glances from early morning browsers. Behind a velvet-draped table sat Marcus Wellington, a middle-aged man with nervous eyes and fidgeting hands, carefully arranging what appeared to be an extraordinary collection of jewelry. The pieces sparkled even in the dim morning light. A magnificent sapphire necklace caught the attention of several passers-by, its deep blue stones seeming to hold secrets within their facets. Beside it lay an ornate diamond tiara, its intricate design speaking of royal craftsmanship. Several bracelets, rings, and brooches completed the display, each piece more stunning than the last. Marcus had been planning this moment for months. As a former employee of the Royal Collection Trust, he had access to detailed records and photographs of items in the royal collection. What most people didn't know was that over the decades, several pieces had been quietly moved between various royal residences, sometimes becoming temporarily misplaced in the vast network of palaces, castles, and storage facilities. 3 months earlier, Marcus had discovered a collection of jewelry in a forgotten vault beneath Windsor Castle during routine inventory work. The items had no recent documentation, and the storage room hadn't been opened in over 20 years, according to the dusty logbooks. After weeks of internal debate and mounting financial pressure from his gambling debts, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He carefully documented each piece, took detailed photographs, and slowly began removing items from the vault. His plan was simple: sell them at the antique market as estate. Jewelry from a private collection, the pieces were so valuable that even selling them for a fraction of their true worth would solve all his financial problems. As the market began to fill with weekend shoppers, Marcus noticed an elegant woman approaching his stall. She wore an expensive coat and had the bearing of someone accustomed to fine things, her eyes immediately fixed on the sapphire necklace. "These are quite remarkable pieces," she said, her voice carrying a refined accent. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. May I ask about their provenance?" Marcus had rehearsed his story many times. "They're from a private estate," he replied smoothly. "A family collection that's been in storage for decades. The owner recently passed away and the heirs decided to sell rather than keep them locked away." The woman nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She examined several pieces more closely, her knowledge of jewelry evident in the way she handled each item. "This setting style," she murmured, pointing to the diamond tiara, "it's very distinctive. Victorian era, but with modifications that suggest royal commission work." Marcus felt his palms growing sweaty. "Yes, well, the family had connections to various noble houses. You know how these old aristocratic families intermarried and shared jewelry between generations." Meanwhile, across the market, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen was enjoying what was supposed to be a relaxing Saturday morning browse through the antiques with her sister. As they wandered between stalls, Sarah's trained eye automatically scanned the various items on display. Years of investigating art and antique fraud had made her naturally suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. Her attention was caught by the crowd gathering around Marcus's stall. Even from a distance, she could see the unusual quality of the jewelry being displayed. Something about the situation felt wrong. The nervous behavior of the seller, the extraordinary quality of the pieces, and the casual way they were being displayed at a street market all raised red flags. "Those pieces look awfully grand for a street market," her sister commented. Following Sarah's gaze, Sarah nodded, her detective instincts fully engaged. "Let's take a closer look." As they approached the stall, Sarah noticed several other details that concerned her. The seller's hands were shaking slightly and he kept glancing around as if expecting trouble. The jewelry itself was clearly of museum quality, far beyond what one would typically find at even the most upscale antique markets. The elegant woman who had been examining the pieces was now in deep conversation with Marcus about prices. Sarah overheard enough to understand that significant sums of money were being discussed. The woman seemed very interested in purchasing several items, including the sapphire necklace and diamond tiara. "I'll need to arrange for proper authentication, of course," the woman was saying. "Pieces of this caliber require careful verification before any serious collector would consider purchasing them." Marcus's nervousness increased visibly, Of course, but I should mention that I have other interested buyers. If you're serious about purchasing, I'd prefer to complete the transaction today to avoid any complications. This statement only heightened Sarah's suspicions. Legitimate sellers of valuable antiques typically welcomed authentication processes, as it increased the value and desirability of their pieces. The pressure to complete a quick sale suggested something wasn't right. Sarah discreetly photographed several of the jewelry pieces with her phone, while pretending to browse other items at nearby stalls. The quality and style of the pieces reminded her of something, though she couldn't immediately place what it was. As the morning progressed, more potential buyers gathered around Marcus's stall. Word was spreading through the market about the exceptional jewelry collection, and several dealers and collectors had arrived to examine the pieces. The attention was exactly what Marcus had hoped for financially, but it was also drawing far more scrutiny than he had anticipated. Among the growing crowd, Sarah noticed a well-dressed elderly gentleman who seemed particularly agitated as he examined the jewelry. He pulled out a magnifying glass and studied several pieces intently, his expression growing more concerned with each item he examined. "Excuse me," the gentleman said to Marcus in a voice that carried authority, "but I believe there may be some mistake about these pieces. The craftsmanship and design elements are extremely specific. I've seen very similar items in museum collections." Marcus's face went pale. "As I explained to everyone, these are from a private family collection. The similarity to museum pieces just reflects the high quality of the original craftsman." The elderly gentleman didn't look convinced, but before he could respond further, a commotion erupted at the edge of the market. Several official-looking vehicles had arrived, and uniformed officers were beginning to make their way through the crowd of weekend shoppers. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen's heart began racing as she watched the uniformed officers approach through the crowded market. Her off-duty morning was about to become very official very quickly. She immediately recognized the distinctive uniforms of the Royal Protection Command, and her suspicions about the jewelry suddenly crystallized into a much more serious concern. "Sarah, what's happening?" her sister whispered nervously as they watched the officers methodically making their way toward Marcus's stall. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent message from her superintendent. The text was brief but alarming. "Suspected theft of crown jewels. Royal Guard en route to Portobello Road. Report immediately if you're in the area." Sarah showed her warrant card to the nearest Royal Protection officer, quickly explaining her presence at the market. Within minutes, she was briefing the arriving team about her observations of the suspicious jewelry stall and the nervous behavior of the seller. Marcus Wellington had noticed the approaching officers and was frantically trying to pack up his jewelry display. His hands shook as he wrapped the sapphire necklace in cloth. But the elegant woman who had been examining the pieces earlier grabbed his wrist. "I don't think you should be putting those away just yet," she said firmly. "Not until we've had a proper conversation about where they really came from." Marcus looked around desperately for an escape route, but the crowd of curious shoppers had formed a natural barrier around his stall. The elderly gentleman with the magnifying glass had positioned himself directly in front of the table, clearly determined not to let Marcus leave with the jewelry. "These pieces," the gentleman announced loudly enough for the approaching officers to hear, "are definitely not from any private collection. I am Professor Edmund Hartley, and I've spent 40 years studying royal jewelry collections. That sapphire necklace belongs to Queen Camilla's personal collection. It was a wedding gift from King Charles, commissioned specifically for their coronation celebrations." The crowd gasped as the implications of Professor Hartley's statement sank in. Marcus tried to protest, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "That's impossible. These pieces have been in a family vault for decades. Young man," Professor Hartley continued, his voice growing stern, "that diamond tiara was featured in Tatler magazine just 6 months ago, when Queen Camilla wore it to the state banquet for the French president. The sapphires in that necklace are from a mine in Kashmir that has been exhausted for over a century. There are fewer than a dozen such pieces in existence, and they're all accounted for in royal collections worldwide." Commander James Morrison of the Royal Protection Command arrived at the stall just as Professor Hartley finished his explanation. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere from curious interest to serious official business. Commander Morrison was known throughout London's law enforcement community as one of the most experienced officers in protecting the royal family and their assets. "Sir," he addressed Marcus with Professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. I need you to step away from the table and keep your hands visible. We have reason to believe these items may be stolen property. Marcus's legs nearly gave out beneath him. I can explain everything. There's been a misunderstanding. I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it, Commander Morrison replied calmly. But first we need to secure these items and ensure they're properly protected. Detective Inspector Chen approached Commander Morrison and quietly briefed him on her observations throughout the morning. She described Marcus's nervous behavior, his reluctance to allow authentication of the pieces, and his pressure for quick sales without proper verification. As the Royal Protection Officers carefully documented and secured each piece of jewelry, more details emerged about their significance. The elegant woman who had been examining the pieces revealed herself to be Lady Margaret Thornfield, a well-known collector and expert in royal jewelry history. Commander Morrison, Lady Margaret said, I recognize several of these pieces immediately. That emerald bracelet was specifically mentioned in the Queen's personal jewelry inventory that was published in the court circular just last month. The pearls in that brooch are from the same strand that belonged to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The crowd of onlookers had grown significantly, and market security was working to maintain order while the investigation proceeded. News of the discovery was already spreading through social media, with several people posting photos and videos of the dramatic scene unfolding at the antique market. Marcus finally broke down under the pressure. I work for the Royal Collection Trust, he admitted in a shaky voice. I found these pieces in a storage vault that hadn't been opened in years. I thought they had been forgotten. I never meant to steal anything that was actively in use. Commander Morrison's expression remained neutral, but his questions became more pointed. Mr. Wellington, these items are not stored randomly in forgotten vaults. Every piece of the royal collection is carefully catalogued and tracked. Even items in long-term storage are regularly inventoried and maintained. Professor Hartley shook his head sadly. Young man, you've made a terrible mistake. Some of these pieces are not just valuable. They're historically irreplaceable. That ruby ring has been in the royal collection since the reign of Queen Victoria. The craftsmanship represents techniques that are no longer practiced. As the investigation continued, Detective Inspector Chen coordinated with the Royal Protection Command to ensure proper evidence collection. Each piece of jewelry was photographed in detail, documented for chain of custody, and carefully secured for transport back to the palace. The implications of the theft were becoming clearer as more experts examined the pieces. Dr. Amanda Foster, a curator from the Victoria and Albert Museum who happened to be shopping at the market, identified additional items that had historical significance beyond their monetary value. That brooch, she explained to Commander Morrison, was worn by Queen Camilla at the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony. It's been featured in multiple official portraits. The fact that it's here, being sold at a street market, suggests a significant security breach in the royal collection storage systems. Marcus was formally arrested and cautioned about his rights, but he continued to cooperate with the investigation. His financial difficulties and gambling debts provided a clear motive for the theft, but the ease with which he had accessed and removed the items raised serious questions about security protocols. Lady Margaret approached Commander Morrison with additional concerns. I've been thinking about the timing of this discovery, she said. If these pieces had been successfully sold today, they likely would have disappeared into private collections around the world. Some of them might never have been recovered. The crowd began to disperse as the official investigation took over from the dramatic street-level discovery. However, news crews had arrived and the story was quickly becoming a major news event. The image of priceless royal jewels being displayed at a London street market was exactly the kind of story that would capture public attention worldwide. Commander Morrison arranged for additional security as the jewelry was prepared for transport back to royal custody. The investigation was far from over, but the immediate crisis of recovering the stolen items had been successfully resolved thanks to the keen observations of Professor Hartley, Lady Margaret, and Detective Inspector Chen. Within hours of Marcus Wellington's arrest at Portobello Road, the story had exploded across every major news outlet in Britain and beyond. The dramatic images of priceless royal jewelry being displayed at a street market created a media sensation that no amount of palace damage control could contain. By early afternoon, News vans lined the streets around the antique market, and reporters were interviewing anyone who had witnessed the morning's events. The story had everything that made for compelling television: royal scandal, priceless treasures, and the dramatic intervention of the Royal Guard at a humble London street market. Victoria Pemberton, the BBC's royal correspondent, was among the first journalists to arrive on the scene. She had covered royal stories for over 15 years, but even she was amazed by the unprecedented nature of this incident. "This is Victoria Pemberton reporting from Portobello Road," she began her live broadcast, where this morning's routine antique market shopping turned into one of the most significant royal security breaches in recent memory. "Behind me you can see where priceless jewelry belonging to Queen Camilla was discovered being offered for sale by a former Royal Collection Trust employee." The story quickly gained international attention as news outlets around the world picked up the dramatic footage of the arrest and recovery operation. Foreign correspondents who had been in London covering routine political stories suddenly found themselves with front-page material. At Buckingham Palace, the emergency communications team was working frantically to manage the public relations disaster. Sir Anthony Blackwood, the palace's director of communications, had dealt with many royal crises over his 20-year career, but the visual impact of this particular incident made it especially challenging to control. "We need to get ahead of this story immediately," he told his team during an emergency meeting. "The optics of the Queen's personal jewelry being sold at a street market are absolutely terrible. We need to emphasize the swift action taken by our security services and the fact that all items have been recovered safely." However, controlling the narrative proved impossible as more details emerged throughout the day. Social media was flooded with photographs and videos taken by market visitors, many of whom had unknowingly witnessed the display of stolen royal treasures. The hashtag #DarsRoyalJewelsGate began trending worldwide within hours. The most damaging aspect of the story was the clear security implications. How had a single employee been able to access and remove multiple pieces of priceless jewelry without detection? The questions being raised in Parliament and the press suggested this was far more than just an isolated theft. Professor Edmund Hartley, who had been instrumental in identifying the stolen pieces, found himself at the center of media attention. His expertise and dramatic role in the morning's events made him the perfect interview subject for news programs trying to explain the significance of what had been discovered. "These weren't just valuable pieces of jewelry," he explained during a televised interview. "Some of these items have been in the royal collection for over a century. They represent not just monetary value, but irreplaceable historical artifacts. The thought that they could have been lost forever is genuinely horrifying from a cultural preservation standpoint." Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen was briefing her superiors at Scotland Yard about her accidental involvement in the case. Her off-duty observations had been crucial in the initial assessment of the situation, but now she found herself assigned to the formal investigation team. "The suspect, Marcus Wellington, appears to have been planning this for months," she reported to Assistant Commissioner David Hughes. "His access to the Royal Collection storage facilities gave him detailed knowledge of inventory systems and security protocols. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was carefully premeditated." The investigation team quickly discovered that Marcus had been struggling with significant gambling debts for over 2 years. His personnel file showed no previous disciplinary issues, and colleagues described him as reliable and trustworthy. The financial pressure had apparently pushed him to make increasingly desperate choices. Lady Margaret Thornfield, whose expertise had helped confirm the authenticity of the pieces, was also fielding numerous interview requests. As a respected figure in London's art and antique community, her perspective carried significant weight with both the media and the public. "What concerns me most," she told the Evening Standard, "is how easily these items could have disappeared into private collections worldwide. Once stolen art or jewelry enters the black market, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult. We were incredibly fortunate that this was discovered before any sales were completed." The story took on additional dimensions as security experts began commenting on the broader implications for royal protection. Former police commanders and security consultants appeared on news programs to discuss how such a breach could occur and what it might mean for overall royal security. Commander James Morrison, while maintaining official discretion about ongoing investigations, did provide a brief statement to the media. The Royal Protection Command takes any security breach extremely seriously. While we are pleased that all stolen items have been recovered, we are conducting a comprehensive review of access protocols and storage security measures. Public reaction was mixed, but intense. Social media showed a range of responses from amusement at the absurdity of finding crown jewels at a street market to serious concern about royal security. Many people expressed sympathy for Marcus Wellington, viewing him as someone who had made a terrible mistake under financial pressure rather than a hardened criminal. The antique dealers at Portobello Road found themselves caught between embarrassment and unexpected publicity. While no one wanted to be associated with stolen goods, the international attention was bringing unprecedented numbers of visitors to the market. Tour groups were already requesting special Royal Jewels tours of the famous stall location. By evening, the story had been picked up by major news networks in the United States, where the combination of British royalty and dramatic crime made for irresistible television content. Late-night talk show hosts were already preparing jokes about finding bargains at London's antique markets. The palace communications team realized they would need to provide more substantive responses to the growing questions about security. The initial brief statements about cooperation with police investigations were no longer sufficient to address the scale of public and media interest. Sir Anthony Blackwood scheduled a full press conference for the following day, but he knew that the story would continue to generate headlines for weeks. The visual image of priceless royal jewelry displayed at a humble street market had created a narrative that would be difficult to overcome through traditional public relations strategies. As the day ended, news editors around the world were already planning follow-up stories about royal security, the value of the royal collection, and the broader implications of the theft. What had begun as Marcus Wellington's desperate attempt to solve his financial problems had become an international news sensation that would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. The morning following the Portobello Road incident dawned with unprecedented media scrutiny focused on Buckingham Palace. News crews had established a semi-permanent presence outside the palace gates, and the usually routine changing of the guard ceremony was now being covered by international television networks, as if it were a state occasion. Inside the palace, King Charles was receiving his first comprehensive briefing about the security breach from Sir Anthony Blackwood and Commander James Morrison. The King's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, was also present to discuss the constitutional and protocol implications of the incident. "Your Majesty," Commander Morrison began carefully, "while all stolen items have been recovered safely, the investigation has revealed several concerning gaps in our storage security protocols. The suspect, Marcus Wellington, had access to areas and inventory systems that we now believe should have been more strictly controlled." King Charles listened intently as the full scope of the security failure was explained. His primary concern was not the personal embarrassment, but the potential implications for the safety of his family and the security of the entire royal collection. "What concerns me most," the king said, "is not what was taken but how easily it was taken. If someone could remove jewelry from our storage facilities, what else might be vulnerable? Our security systems protect not just valuable objects, but centuries of British history and culture." Queen Camilla had been notably absent from public view since the story broke, following advice from the communications team to avoid any public appearances until the immediate crisis had stabilized. However, she was actively involved in reviewing which pieces had been stolen and assessing their personal and historical significance. The stolen items included several pieces that held particular sentimental value for the Queen. The sapphire necklace had indeed been a personal gift from King Charles, commissioned specifically for their wedding celebrations. The diamond tiara had belonged to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and represented a direct link to the royal family's recent history. Sir Anthony Blackwood was preparing for what he knew would be one of the most challenging press conferences of his career. The questions would go far beyond the simple facts of the theft to probe deeper issues about royal security, the management of the royal collection, and the oversight of palace employees. "We need to be completely transparent about what happened," he told his communications team, while also being careful not to reveal operational details that could compromise ongoing security measures. The public has a right to know that we're taking this seriously, but we can't give away information that might help future criminals. Meanwhile, the investigation team led by Detective Inspector Sarah Chen was working around the clock to understand exactly how Marcus Wellington had managed to access and remove the jewelry without detection. Their findings were painting a troubling picture of outdated security protocols and insufficient oversight. The storage facility where the theft occurred hadn't been properly audited in over 3 years, Detective Chen reported to her superiors. Wellington knew from the inventory records that some items in that particular vault were not scheduled for regular inspection. He specifically targeted pieces that he believed would not be missed in the short term. The investigation also revealed that Wellington had been photographing and documenting items in the royal collection for months before the actual theft. His legitimate work duties had provided perfect cover for reconnaissance activities, and he had used his access to create detailed plans for removing specific high-value pieces. Professor Edmund Hartley, who had become something of a celebrity overnight due to his role in identifying the stolen jewelry, was contacted by the palace to provide expert consultation on the recovered items. His knowledge of royal jewelry history made him invaluable in assessing whether any pieces had been damaged during their brief time at the market. Fortunately, Professor Hartley reported after examining the recovered items, "Everything appears to be in excellent condition." The way Wellington handled and stored the pieces suggests he understood their historical importance, even while committing this terrible crime against heritage preservation. The security review being conducted by the Royal Protection Command was uncovering systematic problems that went well beyond the single employee who had committed the theft. Inventory management systems were outdated, access controls were inconsistent, and oversight of storage facilities had been inadequate for years. Commander Morrison was briefing a select committee of senior palace officials about the preliminary findings of the security review. "We're looking at a complete overhaul of how we manage and protect the royal collection," he explained. "This incident has exposed vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by much more sophisticated criminals than Mr. Wellington. The financial implications of the security upgrade were staggering. Installing modern surveillance systems, updating inventory management technology, and implementing proper access controls for storage facilities would require millions of pounds in investment. However, the alternative, risking further thefts of irreplaceable historical artifacts, was unthinkable." Lady Margaret Thornfield had agreed to serve as an external consultant to the security review, bringing her expertise in art and antique security to help identify best practices from museums and private collections around the world. Her involvement helped demonstrate that the palace was taking the incident seriously and seeking expert guidance. The royal collection represents one of the world's most significant accumulations of cultural artifacts, Lady Margaret explained to the review committee. The security standards need to match those of major international museums, with modern technology and rigorous protocols for access and movement of items. Public opinion polling showed that while most people were concerned about the security breach, there was also considerable sympathy for Marcus Wellington as an individual who had made a terrible mistake under financial pressure. This complicated the palace's communication strategy, as they needed to emphasize the seriousness of the crime, while avoiding appearing vindictive towards someone many viewed as a victim of circumstances. The investigation team discovered that Wellington had been visiting gambling establishments regularly for over 2 years, accumulating debts that exceeded his annual salary by a significant margin. Friends and colleagues described a gradual change in his behavior as the financial pressure mounted, though no one had suspected he might resort to theft. His defense attorney, Rebecca Matthews, was preparing arguments that would emphasize Wellington's previous good character, his cooperation with the investigation, and the extreme financial pressure that had led to his poor decision-making. She hoped to secure a sentence that would reflect his status as a first-time offender who had shown genuine remorse. The Crown Prosecution Service was taking a different view, arguing that the theft of royal artifacts represented not just property crime, but an attack on British cultural heritage that demanded serious consequences. The international embarrassment caused by the incident was also being factored into their assessment of appropriate charges. As the security review continued, It became clear that comprehensive reforms would take months to implement fully. In the meantime, additional temporary security measures were being put in place to prevent any similar incidents. Access to storage facilities was immediately restricted, and all inventory movements would require dual authorization. The incident had also prompted questions in Parliament about the overall management and funding of royal security. Several MPs had submitted questions for the Home Secretary about whether adequate resources were being allocated to protect Britain's cultural heritage assets housed in royal collections. King Charles personally reviewed every recommendation from the security assessment, determined to ensure that such a breach could never happen again. His commitment to protecting the royal collection extended beyond personal concerns to encompass his role as guardian of centuries of British history and culture for future generations. 3 days after the jewelry theft had dominated headlines worldwide, Queen Camilla made her first public appearance at a charity luncheon for the National Literacy Trust. The palace communications team had carefully planned her return to public duties, hoping to demonstrate that the royal family was moving forward while taking the security breach seriously. The event was meant to be a straightforward charitable engagement, focusing on literacy programs for disadvantaged children. However, when Queen Camilla was approached by journalists during the reception, her responses to questions about the stolen jewelry would create an entirely new crisis that overshadowed the original theft. Sarah Whitmore, a reporter from The Telegraph, had been granted access to the charity event and saw an opportunity to ask the Queen about the recent incident. Her question seemed innocent enough. "Your Majesty, how did you feel when you learned that your personal jewelry had been discovered at Portobello Road Market?" Queen Camilla's response would be replayed countless times across news programs and social media platforms around the world. "Well, I suppose one could say it gave me a rather unique perspective on how the other half shops," she said with what appeared to be a slight smile. "Though I must say the prices Marcus was asking were far below what I would have expected for such pieces." The room fell silent as journalists realized the implications of what they had just heard. The Queen had seemingly made light of a serious criminal matter and appeared to be joking about the theft of priceless royal artifacts. Even more problematically, her comment about how the other half shops suggested an elitist attitude toward ordinary people who frequented markets like Portobello Road. Sensing that her initial response hadn't landed well, Queen Camilla attempted to clarify her remarks. "Of course, I'm terribly concerned about the security breach, and we're all grateful to the police for their swift action. But one must maintain a sense of humor about these things. After all, no real harm was done." This second comment only made matters worse. Suggesting that no real harm was done seemed to minimize the seriousness of the security failure and the potential consequences if the jewelry had not been recovered. It also appeared to dismiss the concerns of those responsible for protecting the royal collection. Within hours, Queen Camilla's remarks had been transcribed, analyzed and criticized across every form of media. The phrase "how the other half shops" became an instant meme on social media, with users creating humorous comparisons between royal shopping experiences and ordinary market browsing. However, the humor quickly turned to genuine outrage as the full implications of the Queen's comments became clear. Anti-monarchy groups seized upon the remarks as evidence of royal arrogance and disconnection from ordinary people. Republican activists argued that the comments revealed the true attitude of the royal family toward both the general public and serious matters of security. Graham Smith, the chief executive of Republic, the anti-monarchy campaign group, issued a statement that captured much of the public anger. Queen Camilla's flippant remarks about this serious security breach show exactly how out of touch the royal family really is. While ordinary people face prosecution for minor thefts, she treats the theft of priceless public assets as a joke worthy of class-based humor. The palace communications team went into emergency mode as they realized the magnitude of the public relations disaster. Sir Anthony Blackwood called an urgent meeting with King Charles to discuss how to respond to the growing backlash against Queen Camilla's comments. "Your Majesty," Sir Anthony explained, "the Queen's remarks are being interpreted as both elitist and dismissive of the serious security concerns raised by this incident. We need to consider whether a formal clarification or apology might be appropriate." King Charles was clearly troubled by the situation. He had been married to Camilla long enough to know that her comments had been intended as harmless light humor rather than malicious elitism. However, he also understood that public perception was often more important than intention in royal communications. The criticism was coming from multiple directions. Security experts who had been calling for comprehensive reforms to royal protection were outraged by the suggestion that the theft had caused no real harm. Professor Edmund Hartley, who had been instrumental in recovering the stolen pieces, publicly criticized the Queen's characterization of the incident. "With all due respect to Her Majesty," Professor Hartley told the BBC, "this was not a harmless prank or amusing incident. These were priceless historical artifacts that could have been lost forever. The casual attitude toward their theft is deeply concerning for anyone who cares about preserving British cultural heritage." Lady Margaret Thornfield, who had been working closely with the palace on security improvements, was also troubled by the Queen's comments. In a carefully worded statement, she emphasized the serious nature of art and antique theft, and the importance of treating such crimes with appropriate gravity. The political implications were becoming increasingly serious as members of Parliament from both major parties began commenting on the Queen's remarks. Several Labour MPs called for parliamentary questions about royal security funding, while Conservative MPs found themselves in the awkward position of defending comments they privately found indefensible. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, who was leading the criminal investigation, found herself caught between her professional responsibilities and the growing political controversy. While she couldn't comment directly on the Queen's remarks, her team was working to build a serious criminal case that emphasized the severity of the theft and its potential consequences. Marcus Wellington's defense attorney, Rebecca Matthews, saw an opportunity in the Queen's comments to argue that even the victim of the theft didn't consider it a serious crime. However, she also recognized that using royal comments in a criminal defense could create its own complications and potential backlash. The international media coverage of Queen Camilla's remarks was even more critical than domestic reporting. Foreign correspondents, particularly from countries with Republican traditions, presented the comments as evidence of royal arrogance and privilege. The story became a case study in how not to handle public communications during a crisis. Social media analysis showed that negative sentiment toward Queen Camilla had increased dramatically following her comments, with hashtags like Camillagate and royal arrogance trending worldwide. Memes mocking her "How the Other Half Shops" comment were being shared millions of times across various platforms. The charity event where the comments were made also suffered from the controversy. The National Literacy Trust found itself fielding questions about royal patronage and whether the Queen's remarks reflected poorly on their organization. Several donors expressed concern about continued association with such controversial royal commentary. Public opinion polling conducted in the days following the comments showed a significant drop in Queen Camilla's approval ratings, with many respondents expressing disappointment in her apparent lack of seriousness about the security breach. Even supporters of the monarchy found it difficult to defend her characterization of the incident as harmless. The palace was facing pressure to issue a formal response to clarify or apologize for the Queen's remarks, but any such statement risked drawing even more attention to the controversy. Sir Anthony Blackwood was consulting with constitutional experts about the appropriate protocol for addressing public criticism of royal comments. The incident had also damaged relationships with law enforcement and security professionals who felt their efforts to protect the royal family and cultural heritage had been dismissed as unnecessary. Commander James Morrison found himself fielding complaints from his officers about the lack of appreciation for their work in recovering the stolen items. As the controversy continued to grow, it became clear that Queen Camilla's attempt at light humor had created a far more serious and long-lasting problem than the original theft itself. The crisis surrounding Queen Camilla's comments had reached a breaking point after 5 days of relentless media coverage and public criticism. King Charles, after extensive consultations with senior palace officials, constitutional experts, and family members, made the unprecedented decision to personally address the nation about both the jewelry theft and his wife's controversial remarks. The king's televised statement was scheduled for early evening, allowing maximum viewership while demonstrating the seriousness with which the palace was treating the situation. Sir Anthony Blackwood had worked with speechwriters and communications experts to craft a message that would acknowledged the legitimate concerns raised while supporting Queen Camilla without appearing to dismiss the criticism. "My fellow citizens," King Charles began, speaking from his private study at Buckingham Palace, "I want to address directly the recent events concerning the theft of royal jewelry and the subsequent comments made by Queen Camilla. First, let me be absolutely clear. The theft of these historical artifacts was a serious crime that could have resulted in the permanent loss of irreplaceable pieces of our national heritage." The King's statement continued with a detailed acknowledgement of the security failures that had allowed the theft to occur and a commitment to implementing comprehensive reforms. He praised the efforts of law enforcement, security personnel, and the experts who had identified and recovered the stolen items. Regarding Queen Camilla's recent comments, the King said carefully, "I want to emphasize that they were intended as an attempt to inject some lightness into a difficult situation, not to minimize the seriousness of what occurred. However, we recognize that her words were poorly chosen and have caused genuine offense to many people who care deeply about protecting our cultural heritage." While the King stopped short of a formal apology, his statement represented the closest thing to royal contrition that constitutional protocol would allow. He announced that Queen Camilla would be taking a temporary step back from public engagements to allow the controversy to subside, and that she would personally meet with representatives from law enforcement and cultural heritage organizations. The public reaction to King Charles's statement was mixed but generally more positive than the response to Queen Camilla's original comments. Many people appreciated his direct acknowledgement of the problems and his commitment to meaningful reforms, though Republican critics argued that the entire incident demonstrated fundamental issues with the monarchy itself. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Marcus Wellington was proceeding through the courts with significant media attention. His guilty plea to charges of theft and breach of trust meant that the trial would focus primarily on sentencing, but the case had become a symbol of broader issues about economic inequality and the pressures faced by ordinary workers. Rebecca Matthews, Wellington's defense attorney, presented a compelling case for leniency based on her client's previously clean record, his cooperation with the investigation, and the extreme financial pressure that had led to his poor decision-making. Character witnesses testified about Wellington's dedication to his work and his genuine love for the historical artifacts in the royal collection. "Mr. Wellington made a terrible mistake," Matthews argued during the sentencing hearing, "but he is not a career criminal or someone who set out to damage British cultural heritage. He is a man who found himself in desperate circumstances and made choices that he deeply regrets. The swift recovery of all stolen items and his complete cooperation with the investigation should be considered as mitigating factors." The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor James Hartwell, took a firmer stance on the seriousness of the crime and its potential consequences. They argued that the theft represented not just property crime but an attack on national heritage that demanded significant consequences to deter similar future incidents. The defendant's actions could have resulted in the permanent loss of irreplaceable historical artifacts, Hartwell argued. The fact that the items were recovered was due to good fortune and the vigilance of experts, not any restraint on the defendant's part. The sentence must reflect both the seriousness of what occurred and the need to protect our cultural heritage from similar crimes. Judge Patricia Thornton ultimately sentenced Wellington to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of early release after serving half the sentence. She acknowledged his personal circumstances and cooperation, while emphasizing the seriousness of his crimes and their potential consequences. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Thornton said during sentencing, "you have pleaded guilty to crimes that struck at the heart of our national cultural heritage. While I recognize the personal pressures you faced, your actions could have resulted in irreparable losses to future generations. The sentence I impose must reflect both your personal circumstances and the broader public interest in protecting these irreplaceable artifacts." The security reforms promised by King Charles were being implemented with remarkable speed and thoroughness. Commander James Morrison had been given unprecedented authority and resources to overhaul royal protection protocols, with particular emphasis on storage security and access controls. The comprehensive security review had identified over 40 specific areas requiring improvement, From basic inventory management systems to sophisticated surveillance technology, the total cost of the security upgrades was estimated at over £12 million. But the palace had committed to funding the improvements without seeking additional public money. Lady Margaret Thornfield had become the lead external consultant for the security overhaul, working closely with international experts in museum security and art protection. Her recommendations included state-of-the-art tracking systems for individual pieces, biometric access controls, and regular security audits by independent experts. The Royal Collection represents one of the world's most significant accumulations of cultural and historical artifacts. Lady Margaret explained to the Parliamentary Committee reviewing royal security funding. The protection standards must match those of the world's leading museums, with multiple layers of security and constant vigilance against both internal and external threats. Professor Edmund Hartley had been appointed as an official advisor to the Royal Collection Trust, helping to develop new protocols for inventory management and security assessment. His expertise and his role in the original recovery had made him a respected voice in discussions about protecting cultural heritage. The incident had also prompted broader discussions about the management and accessibility of the Royal Collection. Republican groups argued that such valuable cultural assets should be held in public museums rather than private royal collections, while monarchist organizations emphasized the historical continuity represented by keeping the pieces within the royal family. Queen Camilla gradually returned to public duties after a 6-week hiatus, but her public appearances were more carefully managed, and her interactions with media were strictly controlled. The controversial comments had permanently changed how the palace approached royal communications, with much greater emphasis on message preparation and risk assessment. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen had been commended for her role in the investigation and had been assigned to a new unit specializing in art and cultural heritage crimes. Her accidental involvement in the case had demonstrated the importance of having experienced investigators who could recognize suspicious activity even during off-duty moments. The Portobello Road Antique Market had become something of a tourist attraction, with visitors specifically seeking out the stall where the royal jewelry had been displayed. Market organizers had installed a small plaque commemorating the great royal jewelry recovery, turning the embarrassing incident into a point of local pride. Marcus Wellington served 18 months of his sentence before being released on parole. He had completed courses in financial management and addiction counseling during his imprisonment, and had secured employment with a small museum in the north of England. His case had become a cautionary tale about the pressures of gambling addiction and the importance of seeking help before making desperate choices, though long-term impact of the incident extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Royal security protocols had been fundamentally reformed. Public expectations for royal communications had been permanently raised, and the protection of cultural heritage had received unprecedented attention and resources. 5 years later, when historians and security experts looked back on the Portobello Road incident, they recognized it as a turning point that had ultimately strengthened both royal security and public appreciation for the importance of protecting Britain's cultural heritage. What had begun as one man's desperate attempt to solve his financial problems had become a catalyst for comprehensive reforms that better protected irreplaceable historical treasures for future generations.